And we have a submission from you. Thank you so much for giving us a submission which I see has a range of important data information in it. I just wanted to invite you to walk us through it because I think both Senator Mulholland and I haven't had the opportunity to read it. So if there's anything you want to particularly draw our attention to as you make your opening comments, we'd be delighted to hear it, and then we'll come back with questions.
Sure. It went relatively unreported, but over the last few months, the government, the National Supply and Affordability Council, which is the advisory body for the federal government on housing issues, released their State of the Housing report in 2026.
And we had them appear as witnesses in our last hearing. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yep.
What I think in some ways was remarkable about that is, in their own words, they described Australia experiencing not only record low rental affordability, record low house purchase affordability, and record high rental stress. And I think one of the things that I really want to emphasise in this report is a lot of the media commentary, and sometimes even some of the expert commentary, misses the forest for the trees when trying to describe the roots of this crisis and why it is that it just keeps getting worse and worse year after year. And that is in basic terms because for the last few decades, certainly since the 1990s and 1980s even, a bipartisan consensus between both major parties has seen the housing system get turned from a system that did a reasonable job at providing genuinely affordable and quality housing to people, or better and better job, towards a system that treats housing entirely as a lucrative financial asset and a huge profit spinner for banks and property developers. This shift occurred crucially even prior to the Howard government's introduction of the capital gains tax discount in about 1999. That was, of course, a terrible thing and a key part of that shift, but it actually occurred before then. And I suppose I wanted to highlight a few things about that because I think it speaks to why currently the federal government is failing to even come anywhere near address or even turn around the deteriorating housing crisis, which again, and I need to emphasise that since this Labor government was elected in 2022, the housing crisis has just gotten worse every year on the government's own metrics. And that is that the two other big things that happened in the 1980s and 1990s was, one, a shift away from public housing as a universal good for workers towards something that was considered only for particularly disadvantaged groups. And as a result, you saw a cut in public housing funding over the course of those years. Two big things that occurred were under the late in the Fraser government, abolishing the Department of Housing and Public Works, or Housing and Construction, and then the Keating government's decision to cut public housing funding and redirect that towards private rental subsidies. In other words, withdrawing government's role in a large-scale construction of public housing. The second thing that happened under the Hawke and Keating government was large-scale financial deregulation that saw the banks turn around, no longer constrained by federal government regulation, and flood the housing market with credit for investors to purchase housing. There's a really remarkable RBA bulletin that was released in about 2002 that noted that credit for investors, in other words, allowing investors to pay more and more for housing and encouraging them to turn housing into a financial asset, kicked off in the early 1990s, well before the introduction of the capital gains tax discount. Again, the capital gains tax discount helped turbocharge that. Why I painted that picture is, I think, crucial to understanding what's going on right now. And while it's been wildly underreported, the current government is breaking all the wrong records. As of this year, and as of this current government, has the lowest average rate of public housing construction of any government since World War II. Even lower than the Abbott, Morrison, Turnbull governments between 2013 and when were they kicked out, 2022. Not only that, but the total social housing stock between 2022 and today has only increased by just over 7,000 homes. Now, we consider the fact that the federal government has cut funding for over 30,000 National Rental Affordability Scheme homes in that period. There's almost certainly been a net decrease, actually, in this period in affordable rentals for people. Not only that, though, that between 2024 and 2025, according to the Productivity Commission's own data and report on government services, there has been a decline in the total stock of social housing over that period. And that should be a remarkable thing in the context of one of the worst housing crises we've seen since World War II, that the government has continued a trend, to be fair to this government, that has occurred under both Labor and Liberal governments over the last few decades, of constantly cutting and reducing the role of public and community housing in intervening in a broken housing market. The other thing I just want to draw attention to is that one thing that is very prevalent in this housing debate is this concept of supply and this concept of rezoning or giving more power and money to private property developers to provide housing. And the thing I would say about that is what has become abundantly clear since the federal government abandoned its role in the large-scale provision of housing is that private property developers will only ever build when it's profitable to do so. This is not a ideological contention, it's a matter of fact that has been stated by property developers themselves, and you'll find quotes from A.V. Jennings, the head of A.G. Jennings, and Harry Triguboff, who both note that when the market changes, they will drip feed and withdraw housing supply, either in response to decline in house prices, in other words, to help push house prices back up, or when house prices are increasing because it's profitable for them to hold on to those assets and sell them at a later date. A report by economists in 2019 found that property developers were land banking probably about 200,000 lots with development approval. In other words, sitting on an enormous supply of housing and again drip feeding it. And why that is the case is because it is entirely rational for private property developers to act in a way that maximises their profits. The problem being, of course, that maximising profits is completely in contradiction with supplying good quality affordable housing. The recommendations in here I don't think will necessarily surprise everyone, but I suppose the point I want to make, taking a historical perspective and also looking at the current federal government policy, is apart from these small changes to negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, the reality is that this federal government is continuing this decades-long failed housing policy. It just is. And what I find shocking, really, is that there is a real opportunity in this moment for the federal government to take up a legacy that in part was laid by Labor governments in the 20th century of building public housing at scale. And at the high point in Australia, 18% of all homes built every year were built by the government in public housing. If, by the way, the federal government built public housing at the same rate as it used to, over the last 5 years, the government would have built nearly 200,000 public homes and completely eliminated the public housing wait list, or social housing wait list. We have that opportunity to do that here now. And the recommendations in here are things that have probably been circulated before, but I suppose I just want to focus on the concept of the federal government getting involved in public housing construction again. The old Federal Department of Housing and Construction Works, you'll see in this report, used to literally employ thousands of trades workers, architects, town planners, and experts in construction. They were in fact at one point probably the largest housing construction authority in the country. They retained an incredible and diverse and broad expertise in building housing, and as a result were able to help coordinate with the states the construction of public housing in an incredibly efficient scale and at an enormous scale. And there's absolutely no reason why the federal government couldn't coordinate with the states to retain or bring back that capacity. Our proposal is that the government establish a government developer or government builder and build 360,000 homes over the next 5 years and 50,000 homes every year after that. And crucially, no longer make it just available to people on the lowest incomes, but make these homes available to teachers, to nurses, to doctors, to pensioners, to people from all walks of life. Because historically and overseas, the best housing models are those that make homes universally available. Even when you cap rents at 25% of a household's income, or 70% of market rent, whichever is lower, or sell some of the homes at a subsidised rate. The Parliamentary Budget Office, the publicly available costing, found that the impact on the budget or the underlying cash balance would only be about $9 billion over the next 4 years, because the government would collect a lot of money in rental and sales income, similar to successful schemes overseas. And in fact, at 1 year in the government reports in the 60s, the federal government department reported $1.2 billion of rental income from their public housing scheme because workers from a broad cross-section of society lived in them paying subsidised rents. We also highly recommend caps on rent increases. I would note, notwithstanding the ideological debate around caps and freezes on rent increases, in the government's own report, the city with the most affordable rent right now is Canberra, which happens to be the only place in this country that has caps on rent increases. And this is in the context, by the way, of the most unaffordable rental market in recorded history in Australia, certainly since World War II. Some of the highest rates of rental stress since World War II. Nearly 30% now of all renters are in rental stress. The crisis as it is right now, and you've heard from the final thing I'll say before I'm happy to take questions, the reality is that we can talk about the numbers, we can talk about the failure of this government to break from a neoliberal housing consensus that has turned housing into an enormously profitable financial asset and into an enormous amount of financial stress and pain for ordinary Australians. But the final point I would make is, as a society in general, I think we can agree that there are certain things that are essential to life: healthcare, education, housing, electricity and water. But the unique thing about housing, even more than our privatised electricity system, is we have abandoned, essentially, any public role in the provision of this essential service. Completely, almost completely. And what we know about private markets and essential services is people will act in a predatory way, and banks and developers will act in a predatory way to maximise profits and push people into more housing misery as long as they can continue to make a profit. And it absolutely doesn't need to be this way. It hasn't been the case in Australia in the past. In countries overseas, they do it completely differently and recognise it as an essential service, one that can be universally provided by the government at an incredibly efficient and affordable way. But we also, as you've heard from your witnesses, you miss the human consequences of this. Single mums choosing between feeding their kids and paying the rent. Couples giving up on ever being able to buy a home. People spending more and more and more of their take-home income on rent, mortgages, or trying to buy a completely unaffordable house. This has huge flow-on impacts on healthcare, on mental health, on spending money in the community, on small businesses missing out on people going to their small business because they're spending all their money and handing it over to some of the most profitable banks in the world. It is a completely irrational way to run a housing system. And the thing that I would strongly encourage governments of both stripes to think about is stop taking advice from property developers and from banks and from self-described housing experts who have an enormous financial interest in the system running as the way it currently does, and start looking at what works around the world and what Australia has done in the past to alleviate similar scale housing crisis as we've done post-World War II.
Thanks, Max. Thank you so much for your submission and the data you give us. Really, really helpful. I just want to ask you about this inquiry, and your argument is about a larger failure of the post-war period probably, since
Yes.
you're saying really from the early 80s, not even from the moment of capital gains tax, that we dropped a commitment to public housing and we financialised housing for profit, essentially. So if I can bring in the intergenerational lens here, is it your argument that this is not an intergenerational issue, that it is a systemic issue of affecting all? Just how do you respond to one of our terms of reference, which is, is there an element here that is an important new vector of inequality that is generational? What's your response to that?
Well, it certainly is generational in the sense that everyone born, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, as they came into adulthood, they inherited a housing system that was completely broken with hyperinflated house prices and rents as a result of the changes we've just talked about, and this both Labor and Liberal governments embracing of neoliberal pro-developer profit housing system. But what I would say is, while there is definitely a generational lens, that much is obvious, the housing crisis affects people from all sorts of generations. And certainly one of the things to think about right now is those people who are coming up to retirement, in particular single people who currently don't own their homes. And I've spoken to many a pensioner who rents, who is in severe financial stress. I've spoken to many an older single parent in their 40s or 50s who had long since given up on being able to afford to buy a home, but is trapped in a completely broken private rental market. And so sometimes I worry about thinking about it. I say this as a renter myself and someone who was born in the 90s. But what I would say is, if we are going to change this and build the sort of social majority that we need to break the power that banks and developers wield over our political system, then it's going to require building a broad coalition that ensures that a pensioner in their 70s recognises they have the same material interests as a renter in their 20s. And they do. I think the government's experiencing this a little bit right now with the pushback on their to be fair to the government, relatively small changes to negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, that the property industry and banking industry wields an enormous amount of power. And if you're going to cop that pushback, at the very least, actually make changes that threaten their material and financial interests. Because ultimately, the interests here that are juxtaposed or in opposition are the vast majority of people and the small few who benefit enormously from bank profits and property developer profit.
Thanks for that. Just before you appeared, we heard evidence from a witness who talked about the $1 million increase that he now faces as a single parent in the house price that he would need to meet over a 5-year period, while $1 million increase in the value that he has to find to meet as a purchaser, and the probably 10,000 increase in real wages that he's probably had over that same period. And he was asking us and the government to think laterally. For example, he mentioned a 95% tax on capital gains on investment property. And then he talked about a very large stamp duty charge, for example, on investment sales. What's your thinking about measures like that which try and pull back the banking of the gain by investors in the last 5 years in housing in particular?
It's a really good idea. The thing I would say, two things on that, is what that identifies is that investors flooding the property market have been one of the things that has hyperinflated house prices. I would say, at the very least, the government should look at removing the grandfathering measures that have allowed everyone currently with access to negative gearing to continue to negatively gear their properties. If you're forgiven for thinking in the current debate in the media, but the reality is someone with 200 investment properties still gets to negatively gear all 200 of them. That's a massive problem. And so any measure that I think helps dissuade or push investors away from investing in property towards more productive parts of the economy would be a good thing. I would, in this report, and one thing that I recommend is that the government should look at pre-1980s style regulation on the banks again, in particular heavily restricting the bank's ability to lend to property investors to purchase property. In other words, heavily restricting the credit that banks try and shove out there to encourage people to purchase property as an investment, which helps significantly reduce property investors' activity in the market. I mean, it's worth noting that I think now, as of the latest ABS lending indicator data, something like 40 to 45% of all properties purchased right now purchased via a loan from the bank for a property investor. Double the rate of first-home buyers. I think it's sort of incredible, actually, that we have a system that allows our financial sector to make hundreds of billions of dollars of profits over the last few decades, essentially encouraging wealthy people to pour their money into a system that turbocharges house prices, regardless of the consequences for first-home buyers. Or people trying to get a secure home. And yeah, I mean, God knows how a single parent is able to buy a house right now. And even if they do, they're trapped with mortgage repayments that push them into a huge amount of financial stress, right at the edge of what they're able to afford.
You mentioned the other costs, the human costs, it was your word, of a failed housing market, or the problem for renters and for people locked into very large loans or unable to get into home purchasing. if we had a better measure of those costs on the welfare of children, of families, of health, the cost that we know is very real of homelessness, is that something we should be looking at so we have a more transparent cost-benefit analysis of the real cost of a failed housing system?
Well, yes. And, you know, the reality is currently the way our housing system measures it is how much are the banks and developers making in profit. And the thing is that that's even embedded in the government's current housing policy because, again, what the government will talk about is encouraging housing supply. And what developers will tell you is, well, we'll only build when it's profitable to do so. And so there's this completely wild contradiction. On the one hand, it is abundantly clear that we need house prices to go down. And we need house prices to go down because that's the only way you make housing more affordable for people to purchase. But on the other hand, what developers will say is, well, we'll only build when it's profitable to do so, and we need house prices to be high so we can make a bigger profit. And there is only one way you can break that system. You can measure it better, but policy-wise, the only way to break that system is to break the monopoly that private developers have over the supply of housing, and via a major government intervention in the construction of housing. I think a renter in Vienna, you know, this is in Austria where 60% of all housing is some form of government or community-built rent-controlled housing. A renter in Vienna can get a 2-bedroom apartment for the equivalent of about $250 a week Australian in rent. A beautiful apartment, by the way, a lot better built than a lot of our crappy private developer apartments are built, which if you speak to a carpenter or electrician, they'll say that they over their dead bodies would they live in a modern built apartment in a lot of places and across Australia. And that's precisely because the government has made a decision that housing is so important, like healthcare, that it shouldn't be left to the private market to provide. And when you remove the land and the homes from private speculation and you take it out of the irrationality of the way the private market operates and prices things and price things in a way that recognises them as an essential service, you get a way better housing system. And maybe the final way I would ask people to think about it is everyone has to pay some housing costs. We all have to pay rent or mortgage. Now, even if you capped it, the question as a society we have to ask is, do we want people to pay their rent or housing costs towards a scheme that helps us build more good quality affordable housing? Or do we want to pay that rent and mortgage to extremely wealthy property investors and extremely profitable banks so they can send those profits offshore, especially with the banks, into the profit margins of US equity firms who own all our banks? It's like we are sort of... such is the lack of imagination, such is the small-mindedness of our political class, is that they seem to be collectively okay with a housing system that gives more money to BlackRock and Vanguard via our housing system than it does towards building public housing in this country for the people that we're meant to represent and care about. The thing about ideology, which dominates this housing debate, by the way, is it makes completely crazy things seem utterly normal. And I think if you sat someone down and said, do you think we should give hundreds of billions of dollars in profit over a decade to Vanguard and BlackRock, two US-owned investment firms or whatever they are, or should we spend that money on building public housing? I think most people would say build public housing, except for the people who own shares in BlackRock and Vanguard.
Last question before I hand over to Senator Mulholland. What's your thinking then about mechanisms that could be used to deal with land banking or apartment banking?
Well, I think at a council and state level, certainly you can have a use it or lose it planning system, where they do not build on those approved developments, they just lose their planning approval. But to be honest, the best thing that could happen is that the federal government starts playing a big role with the state governments in mandatorily acquiring land bank land. Basically what should happen is the state and federal government should go out there, find every piece of land that has certainly land, for instance, in cities, that is land banked. Like you see these huge blocks of land in the middle, right next to big public transport hubs that haven't been built on for decades, that are just vacant, land banked by a developer. The federal and state government should just set up a fund to go and mandatorily acquire that land. Now, the thing is that might cost a bit of money, but it'll become an asset for the government. And they should immediately build on it. I think developers would very quickly decide that they want to start building on the land when they realise that if they don't build on it, a government developer will come along, mandatorily acquire it for a commercial rate. and build good quality housing on it.
And what about vacant apartments? Any thoughts on?
At a federal level, you could introduce a national vacancy tax that increases every year. So if a developer or an investor is deliberately keeping that apartment vacant, you simply tax them as a proportion of the value of their property, increase that tax every year until it becomes financially prohibitive for them to keep it vacant. There's a lot of contention over how many vacant properties there are in Australia. ABS, on the census night, said there was 1 million vacant homes. Some of those are vacant for other reasons. The best evidence I've seen is it's somewhere between 500 and 700,000 vacant homes in Australia, which is incredible. Again, because we have a housing system where it's profitable for them to just sit on it and refuse to rent it out.
Okay, thanks for your evidence, Max. Over to you, Senator Mulholland.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us, Mr. Chandler-Mather. Could you give us a bit of background about you and the Green Institute as well?
Sure. The Green Institute is the official research institute of the Australian Greens.
And just talk me through how that operates.
In what sense?
How do you operate as the official think tank of the Australian Greens Party?
I suppose with a board that I'm answerable to, and we sort of have to work within the confines of our constitution.
Okay, thank you. No, it's just helpful because there's been a lot of conversation this morning about the political class. So for transparency, it's just always good to know who we're dealing with.
Yeah.
As a former federal MP as well, always good to be clear about who we're dealing with. I'm not going to go over the content that's already been raised by the chair because I'm conscious that we're up against time. I've had a quick look through your recommendations. Thank you very much for providing a submission to us. I'm interested on your recommendation about deregulating the banking sector, because obviously we've had a lot of talk about today about negative gearing and capital gains tax and how that's operating in the market over the last 30 years. But interesting, you made a couple of comments before about some recommendations from the Institute around particularly phasing out lending to investors and how you might see that operating and the sort of consequences, how that might benefit the system.
The one time over the last decade where we saw any decrease in property prices was when APRA, basically the financial regulator, briefly stepped in and actually forced banks to restrict the amount of money that they were lending to investors. And you actually saw, surprise, surprise, a small decrease in property prices. How that would work is you could either do it via APRA or via legislative change. The government has significant powers to regulate the banks, which they gave up in the 1990s and 1990s. Essentially to limit, and eventually you could look at completely phasing out banks' ability to lend to property investors to purchase property. Now, that wouldn't ban investors from purchasing property because if they had the money, they could purchase them outright. But what it would do is significantly reduce the credit flooding around the housing market to purchase property. Now, the huge advantage of that is that would have a big deflationary impact on house prices because, as you can imagine, what happens at an auction is an investor who has significant lending power as a result of our deregulated banking system can bid up the price of housing, similar to the way they can access negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Of course, that's changing to an extent. Why that's really useful as well is it makes building public housing more affordable, because if land is cheaper and if there's less speculative investment in land, which is what our banking sector currently encourages, it's more affordable for the government to purchase land or commercial land and convert that into public housing. I think it's really important to emphasise that hyperinflated land and property prices do not, as a rational way of designing our economy and society, are utterly irrational. Of course, people will say, well, that's a way to build wealth, but I suppose what I would say is if we got to choose where hundreds of or trillions of dollars of investment went, for instance, currently Australians owe the banks $1.8 trillion in mortgage debt, just the four. I would say we're better off putting that in business and productive business than we are in land speculation and property.
Thank you. I also just want to touch on on public housing as well, because I know you've got some stats in your submission about the investment in public housing. One of, I suppose, the features of the public housing system in Australia is that it's a shared responsibility. Well, it's actually been predominantly a state and territory responsibility for a long time. In recent years, and the Commonwealth has sort of come back to the table in investing in public housing. So when we talk about public housing, what's your feedback for state and territory governments as well, and councils as well, because this is a shared responsibility across the three levels of government to get this right?
Yes, well, obviously they should be investing more. What I would say is the federal government is not really currently investing in public housing. Their one real housing investment scheme is at the moment is the Deeply Irrational Housing Australia Future Fund. And I saw a recent report that it has in its entire operation completed just over 1,000 homes.
1,400.
1,400, but who's counting? And look, you know, you said the federal government...
if we're going to get political on that, just on that, I have visited a number of community housing projects across Queensland and held roundtables with those community housing providers who grab me by the arm and say, make sure the HAF continues because we are delivering this stuff. I've met with people in Deception Bay and Redcliffe and Margate and Chermside and all over this state who are living for the first time in secure housing delivered by HAF and community housing providers. Right. So, you know, there are people out there who are really relying on us. I don't disagree that we need to continue to put our shoulder to the wheel, but we call it deeply irrational. There are people who are absolutely benefiting from it right now out there.
Sure, and every person you've met, there's 20 more who are denied that because the government won't actually invest in public housing in the way they should. Now, I think it's good that you bring that up because, from my perspective, that relief that you saw on that person's face, the public housing, social housing waitlist is 170,000 applications long. It has a 10-year waitlist.
Which is run by a state and territory government, a housing list.
But the waitlist is getting longer every year. The unmet need for social housing on latest measure in 2023 is 640,000 homes. That's 640,000 families who are denied the opportunity you just talked about. Now, the reason I say that the Housing Australia Future Fund is deeply irrational is because it does not invest in social housing. What it does is encourage community housing. It's so ridiculously complicated. It encourages community housing providers to take out a loan. They then go to the federal government and say, we need this much money to service the loan to buy the house. And the reason that we're not seeing many homes built by this ridiculous fund is because that is a
ridiculous fund that's housing Australia.
Deeply irrational way to fund community or public housing. Now, what I would say, Senator, is my message to the Commonwealth and to the state governments is the best way to build public housing is to invest money in building public housing. The government is not, by the way, either state or federal or territory investing in it. In fact, every year from 2023 to 2025, we've seen a drop in the public housing stock. Between 2024 and 2025, we've seen a drop in the total social housing stock in Australia. It's going backwards. And the only way we're going to turn this around is if the federal government starts investing in it at scale the way that it used to, in cooperation with the states. 70% of all funding for public housing at the high point of public housing construction in Australia came from the federal government. There is just no way we do not fix this without the federal government getting involved. And I know these, look, you know, say getting political, but these are just the facts. Every bit of this data, the fact that the Labor government that is overseeing the lowest rate of construction of public housing since World War II, that is drawn from government data. And I think the thing that the government doesn't want to confront is that there is a contradiction between the story the government tells about their belief in social housing and actually when the rubber hits the road. Because if you look at the raw money spent, it is cut. It is significantly less than even the Howard government invested in public and community housing, which, let me tell you, they were not good.
Perhaps they didn't have the Greens tying things up in the Senate for 2 years.
Well, can I just point out that you see there's a tiny little spike in the number of homes in 2023, 2024. That was because we sat down with the government and secured the only direct investment this government invested in the last parliament in social housing by the $3 billion that we secured, because we sat across the table, and I'm happy to talk about this, from the Prime Minister and the Minister for Housing, and begged for more money for public housing. And there was two sides of that negotiation. There was one, the government that wanted to spend less on public and community housing, and the Greens who wanted to spend more. look, my advice, if you want to win this debate, is go out there and convince your government to invest more in public housing, because you're just not going to win it. You can't, on the current numbers right now, the current government is investing on average proportionally or building less public housing than the Morrison, Turnbull, Abbott government did, and that was shocking for public housing. Because ideologically it will be admitted in private, but maybe it won't be admitted in public, the government has given up on the idea that public housing can be a large-scale fix to this housing crisis. Now, again, this is not just this government's fault, but they're continuing this policy. And what I would encourage the Labor government to think about is think about what Whitlam did. Everyone loves to talk about, the Prime Minister loves to talk about growing up in public housing. Well, there are so many people like the Prime Minister right now who denied that opportunity when they're born today because they're not doing what the Whitlam government did. And what the Whitlam government did was set up a Department of Housing and Public Works that employed thousands of tradies and architects and town planners and treated housing like the essential service that it is. And there is no reason why we can't do that again. I know it's frustrating to hear, and I know that any Labor member of Parliament will take this as a criticism, but it's a policy criticism. And the frustration is we are a much wealthier country than we were in the 20th century or post-World War II. We have much better construction techniques. We have a much bigger housing crisis. The only reason not to invest in public housing right now is to protect a housing system that makes money for banks and property developers. And what I would say is that experience that you had of talking to those people whose lives are changed by getting out of the private housing market, I would encourage you to go and speak to the 1.2 million people who don't have access to that and are currently in housing stress and may end up having to wait for 10 to 15 years to get anywhere near something resembling an affordable home. And we only live once, so 10 years of your life is a lot to give up as a result of two sides of politics who've decided that they're better off protecting the profits of banks and developers than they are taking them on and doing what governments used to do in this country and do around the world and build public housing at scale.
I'm conscious of time. I've got Hugh Shelter and the other witnesses here, so I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Mulholland, and thank you. One last question. Do you have a view about the difference between community housing providers and public housing? Yeah, we're at the end of our time, but just wanted to make sure we hear your view on that.
The to be honest, the biggest benefit with public housing, there's a lot of benefits above community housing. One, community housing providers are forced to try and become financially viable, which is very difficult for small organisations. But the biggest thing we need to think about is economies of scale. The federal government, if it brought to bear its enormous resources and started directly employing tradies and architects and coordinated across the country, could just build housing at a much more affordable rate and at a much greater scale if we started building public housing again. It's because, again, the government just wants to try and give up as much responsibility as possible. The emergence of community housing was as a result of the government trying to give up its responsibility to provide housing for its citizens, which is a great shame. And we're just never going to fix the housing crisis relying on community housing providers. They don't have enough money, they don't have enough resources, they can't reach the economies of scale. The final thing I'll say is, there's a Department of Housing report, I think in 1969, and you look at the number of homes they built for the amount of federal investment. And if you account for inflation, the federal investment per home built was about $120,000 in today's money. Precisely partly because they could build it efficiently and at scale, and they didn't have to outsource to private construction companies who are often, internationally owned and there to make a quick buck off the government.
Thank you so much, Max, for your evidence, for your submission. And we've agreed that responses to any questions that we might have asked on notice should be provided within 2 weeks of receiving the copy of Hansard, and we really appreciate your time today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.